Welcome to another edition of Inside Government. I'm Cedric Peterson. As we continue in our discussion with the Ministry of Vromi, the first edition, we covered the Minister, the Honorable Christophe Emmanuel. Now we're going to get more into the inner workings of the department. And today my guest is Policy Advisor within the Department of Vromi, Mr. Geert van der Leest. And we're going to get into the policy aspect of the ministry and see how that works. Well, first of all,
Yes.
Thank you for taking this interview.
You're right, Cedric. Thanks for coming here, for the invitation. And we'll see how it's running.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, your position. What exactly do you do within the department?
I came to St. Martin from the Netherlands 5 years ago. I had experience in all kind of government municipalities in the Netherlands, and I want something completely different, and therefore I changed my mind and went to St. Martin. St. Martin as Senior Policy Advisor from the Policy Department. I started 5 years ago, mainly on the spatial planning part, advising the Minister, advising the SG from Vromi, the Secretary General, advising colleagues about spatial planning, about housing policy, helping other colleagues with feedback on nature and environment. Because of the experience in the Netherlands, I know from a lot of topics a little, and from the spatial planning, I'm more the specialist on that part. And also about legal matters, making the ordinances, for example. So that's in general what I'm doing.
Now, of course, you don't do this by yourself. You're surrounded by a team of individuals. Tell us a bit about your department.
The department is a small department. I have to think one policy advisor on spatial planning. I'm the senior policy advisor on planning. We have one policy advisor, nature and environment. We have one policy advisor on nature itself. We have an archaeologist,
Archaeologist?
Jay Harvest. Maria Richardson for the support, and Miklas Gittersen for the GIS matters, Geographical Information System, a digital platform.
Interesting.
That's what it is. And in the past, we had a head of the department. He left, and since 3 years, I'm the acting head of the department, temporarily, they say, but it's already for 3 years now.
Gotcha. Now, when we're looking at the structure, and it's still a learning process since we've become a country, where does your department fit in to the Ministry of Vromi's overall structure?
The ministry has several executing departments. We have starting the SG as the director from the ministry, but below that it's I think 5 or 6 executing departments, and the policy department is between the Secretary General and the executing departments, because we are making the policies and just not execute them. That's what the other departments doing. We are making the policies, the advices. We also are there to help the other departments, because from the executing part, always they have experience about things which can be run better in the future. And then they come to us and ask, can we arrange some improvements in regulations? Because in the executing part, it seems not working sometimes like they want to. And they ask us to advise to improve the legislation.
How often does that happen?
Once a year, when making the year plans, I always make an inventory to the other departments and ask them, what is your need? And then they come up with things or not. It's only once a year.
Now, looking at the core tasks of the policy department, give us a good idea of exactly what the function is, and at the core level.
The core tasks, we are making products, and I name it products. It's mainly about policies and ordinances. In the past, we made a beach policy. In the past, we made a hillside policy. We are now busy with several policies, one about nature. We're drafting a policy about environment. we are making a vision and spatial development strategy. That's how do you call it? Structure vision on how to move forward with the spatial planning for St. Martin on the long term. And more in detailing from this general policy will be zoning plans. Zoning plans is an important product of our department. Zoning plans are the legislation to give rights on what to build and what to use the land for on St. Martin. It's an addition on the building ordinance. We are very busy with it, preparing that. Mm-hmm. So that's more in detailing from the spatial development strategy. And we are also busy with a housing policy, mainly to see the role of the government. We are talking about public housing. And a big object is the making of a new Vromi, how do you say it? General ordinance, keeping together all the individual legislation which is now into effect in one big legislation, in one big ordinance. So if people have questions about environment or about building things, now everything is in different ordinances legislated, and we want to put it in one, so people can see one document, and there all the chapters having the different topics. So we hope that will be more transparent.
Looking at the zoning and development, it was a project that I personally was a part of at some point. This goes back to the year 2013, 2014, I believe it is. Mm-hmm. How are we coming along with that specific aspect of your department?
We made all the draft documents ready for public review. Draft documents meaning per district we made a new ordinance. Mm-hmm. About 13 districts, generally the same as the districts in St. Martin itself. Some of them were ready already for public review. They were put on public review in the newspaper. We're talking about Simpson Bay area, about cul-de-sac area, Cape Bay, Little Bay, and Middle Region Dutch Quarter. Those districts already put on public review. 2 of them are ready to move forward to the minister to get approval to send them forward to the Council of Advice. And after that, Council of Ministers and Parliament had to establish it. And some are waiting on advice of the Committee of Experts, who making advices on the objections given. Most of the zoning plans get some objections. A lot of objections in Simpson Bay area and a few in the other areas. And that's the state of affairs at this moment. All the documents are ready in draft to put on public review if we're ready to do so.
And the
that's
minister,
the state of affairs.
Okay. The minister has been very excited about the possibility, of course, affordable housing. And you just talked about the housing development plan. Tell us a little bit about that aspect. How is that going?
Spatial development plan, zoning plan, it's the same. You have 2 words, sometimes a little confusing, but we are talking about the same thing, zoning plan, development plan. It can arrange all kind of land use, so we can arrange the use for housing, to give a destination of zoning for land which is now not occupied, for example, to allow there to get it developed for houses. The only thing what not can be arranged in zoning plans is how cheap or how expensive the houses are. Sometimes you see in some other countries the law is giving that possibility to make regulations into that kind of spatial development regulations. Here in St. Martin is not the case. So if you say, hey, listen, what is government regulating on the more social housing side, the cheaper homes, it can't not be regulated into the zoning plans directly. So, but we, in general, the housing in general, we made a zoning for all the existing things in place. So we respect all the rights that are given in the past. We're not changing that, but we're just adding areas to also get ready to build. And we also made a survey before we did to see what is needed, what space is available, and what can be done without affecting the nature, for example. So mainly between the low areas and the hilltop areas, in some cases there are still areas available for possible housing.
Find it very interesting, and I'm sure it must be a challenge in establishing that balance. How do you look at that when it comes to ensuring that infrastructure does not affect the natural balance of the environment? How does that work?
I think for this St. Martin, this is one of the biggest challenges. A very important document still is the hillside policy. That's a policy established, I think, in 1996 already, and always in place, related mainly to building requests to get a building permit. When people come to the Vromi ministry and asking a permit, we check the hillside policy to see if it's in line with that policy. And the hillside policy in general is allowing housing into the hills, but only the higher you go, the less is allowed. Less houses, more green, also on the steeper parts, less housing is allowed. And the highest parts are not allowed. That's the policy. Sometimes there's deviating from policy when there are specific reasons which are heavier when giving these considerations. But this is the general policy. We translated the policy one-on-one in the zoning plans. So in the past, the policy was related to the permits, to giving the permits, and it will be related. But then in the zoning plans, again, if people come into the ministry, permit department will check the zoning plans if they are in place and come to the conclusion yes or no.
You mentioned a few areas that are clear that you're busy in the department working with. Is there some other areas that you can further elucidate on that your department is currently focused on?
I told already about the spatial development strategy, but I will emphasize that because it's a very important document, which is the basic line to go, where to go to in the future, mainly about spatial planning, but also aspects of nature and environment. And it's somehow, it is already drafted, but it is at the moment we have some consultations internally within the ministries, and also we'll have consultations externally with some bigger stakeholders in St. Martin to check what the needs are, and if what we wrote down, if that's clear enough for them to run to the future. Zoning plans are the detailing of it, but also the detailing it will take place in the nature policy and in the environmental policy, and those two documents are also very important because as of yet there are no policies on nature or on environment. The only policy is the hillside policy, keeping the hills as clean as possible in the top of the hills. But there are no official other policies. For example, on if you're talking about nature, for example, how to not only to have the hills green, but how to keep it green in the sense of maintenance, about the vision on, for example, with a big word, nature parks. The proposal is, for example, to really establish by law some nature parks in the future to get them safeguarded for the future, for expanding other ways. So, policy is needed. It's not there, so we're drafting that on the nature, for example, for nature parks, but also to facilitate, for example, the how do you call it? The mullet pond in a part of the Simpson Bay area. Mullet Pond. Last year, we promoted it to get it established as a nature park on the Ramsar wetland site. It's a UNESCO United Nations destination, but with that kind of decisions, it can be legally protected. If you have a policy on this, you have more facilitation. You can more facilitate those recommendations and those decisions. So that's the nature part. Also, environmental policy, very important to support the in combination with the zoning plan. Where are companies allowed to build, having their company? How to regulate the nuisance, the pollutions, the noise, or whatever is the case. The zoning is regulating the zones where those companies are able to come. But the policy is mainly regulating the conditions which can be put into place. Under which conditions is it allowed? How many pollution is acceptable? What kind of water pollution is acceptable? What kind of noise pollution is acceptable? Also, there is a combination with the hindrance ordinance, which gives the norms about which companies need a hindrance permit. And in the permit, the conditions are given by law. So, yeah, these are important documents. I already spoke about housing vision. It's still a draft, so it's preliminary. We're still busy with it, and we proceed with that.
Let's break down the hindrance permit. First and foremost, let's define it. What is a hindrance permit?
It's some kind. The same thing as a building permit, but then this is mainly for only for a list of companies. There is a list of companies which need a permit. If you are on the list with your company, or you are a similar company as on the list, then you have an obligation to get a permit when starting a company. It's mainly about the bigger companies, but big is also a car wash with several generators for having air or whatever. So it's about big companies, but it's also about the smaller companies, but not the smallest. You have to be on that list, and if you are on that list, you have to ask the permit. And it's mainly about giving conditions under which circumstances you are allowed to have the company running.
Looking at St. Martin, and I'm sure that we have some challenges. Can you give us an insight into what the challenges are when it comes to zoning and development overall or in general?
The challenge is, first of all, I think, getting aware of the need to regulate things, because things are regulated, but more in general. And one of the big conclusions is the developments during the years. It isn't competing for space on this island. 30 years ago, space enough. There was no competition at all because there was enough. And now we are really competing for space for all the things we want to develop on the island for the future. Not only about agriculture or nature or industries or housing. Land is scarce, and we have to make choices. Where do we want to develop what, and what kind of investment is needed to do that? And that's the most important thing, to get aware of the need of choices to make and write them down in policy or in legislation, and really to execute those ordinances, because writing down is one thing, but executing and enforcement is the following step. I think those are the most important challenges.
I think that segues right into my next question, which would be why the importance to stress legislation and policies and making sure that those things are in effect.
I think it's we did have several town hall meetings in the past for when drafting the zoning plans. We did some consultations with the people. We ask them if there are questions left on the drafts, if the message is clear, if they can live with those regulations, if they are really getting established. There came questions, of course, because what is happening with us, and are we not free anymore to build and to do what we want? But every time we told them, yeah, there will be some regulations, but we will respect the regulations and the rights you have already now. But it is very important to be aware that, it can be giving a restriction sometimes, but not only for you, but it's also for your neighbor. And it's also for the neighbor at the back and at the side. Or it's also a rule for a company who wants to start at the back of your yard. The rules will be there for everyone. Which means if you read them, you see what the rights are, and you can be assured that government need to enforce and execute those rules. Meaning, not everything is allowed in the future. It gives you some certainty for your own properties. What will be next to you? What will be in your street coming? What is allowed in your district? Now it's waiting and see what's happening. Okay, we try to manage as ministry the things which are already regulated, but sometimes things are not regulated. And with the zoning, it will be a little more detailed. So you are more aware and you know what your rights are. And that's one of the most important messages. And if people realize that, okay, it gives some power to government to give some restrictions, but it gives also power to the people to go to the government and say, hey, listen, these are my rights. You have to execute them. And if government is not wanting to, you can go to court. And if people realizing that, in general, the reactions were positive.
I was just thinking about that along the lines of the actual citizen, and when they're looking at zoning and development, and if it's going to be more strict and, of course, guided for the future, how does it affect people who are looking, I guess, at commercial venture? Then there is private venture, which is the building of a home. The future of a citizen looking at zoning and development, what would it mean to the average man?
I will not say it's always a restriction. It is an adding with more rules, some more rules. There are already rules in the building ordinance, for example, and the hindrance ordinance. And there will be some added rules to get this guided more properly. But what I say, it's also giving rights. For example, we are asked to facilitate some extra building height in the lower areas of the country. So listen, at the end, there is no space left. And what can we do? Yeah, we can build until the top of the hill, but we can also choose to make some difference and say, hey, listen, we allow a little more high rise lower in the hills, lower in the lower areas, in the flat areas. So people, if they want to buy to build a house for them or for children, it is allowed under certain conditions. It is not always restricting, it's also allowing under certain conditions. And that's stated by law. In the flat areas, it's probably possible in the future to get some more stores on your current first floor. And that's also the case for citizens. So I can't answer the question in general in the individual cases, but in general, this will be the line. Of course, the hillside policy in the hills higher up, but more facilities in the lower areas.
We see construction in the hills, of course, takes place, and it creates the issue of the infrastructure overall after heavy rainfall, for example. Where does the policy or guideline take us in regard to ensuring that we build responsibly when looking at building on the hillside? What is the vision there?
In the zoning plans, there is a regulation drafted, and that's new. It's not now. We have no legal things now. We are only for the infrastructure itself, but not building on lots. The zoning plans, we have some regulations added for building on lots, meaning if you build on a lot, the water flow coming down from the hill downwards must be the same as it was in the natural circumstance. If you're building and there will be more water coming down, it's not allowed. Meaning there will be conditions to develop your property in such a way with drainage or with some areas with water retaining, so to avoid coming down quickly the water downwards. Mm-hmm. And that will be a legal thing for the future. And so we hope to avoid more water coming down in a fast way, because that's causing the biggest problem.
When looking at legislation and policy, how is it normally organized to get it established and then put into law? How does that process go? I'm sure it must be a complicated one.
For people who are not aware of it, it's awful a difficult thing. But at the end, for policy, it's not that difficult. We're drafting the policy most of the time in consultation with stakeholders. In the draft version, we gave it to the Secretary General as advised. As the SG Secretary General is advising the Minister. And it is up to the Minister to approve the policy, yes or no. Sometimes the policy is affecting other topics than only Vromi, and then he has to go with that document to the Council of Ministers, because they're talking all the kind of topics about economic affairs, tourism, or cultural parts, or whatever. And then it's up to the Council of Ministers to approve it. Then we put it at the end in the newspaper, making announcement, Staatscourant, National Gazette it's called. And when that is published in the paper, so it is known after that period of time, it's into effect. It's a policy into effect. So that's pretty easy. If you have a law, it's more difficult. But in general, it's making a draft law, let in legal affairs advise about this in draft, let establish it approve it by the minister, then it's going to the Council of Advice to advise about the legal matters. Then it's coming back, we make some changes if needed, and go to the Council of Ministers, and they send it to the governor, and he sends it to the parliament. And then it's up to the parliament to say when will this put on the agenda to get it established. And you can never predict before. If they ask me how many time is needed to get it established by parliament, I can't say, because it's about the agenda of the parliament. When will they put it on? It's theirs. So, but that is in general the way of how it's running.
Senior Policy Advisor for the Department of Vromi, Mr. Geert van der Leest, thank you so much for being a part of this interview in our special edition of Inside Government and giving us some insight in regard to how the Department of Policy works at the Ministry of Vromi. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Thanks.